Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and petrol heads all around the world, welcome to episode 3 of F1 Radio. F1 Radio is your dedicated source of anything and everything you need to know in the world of Formula 1. We bring you all the latest paddock gossip and racing rumours, as well as reviewing Grand Prix events and answering your questions in the listeners' Q&A segment. Come rain or shine, F1 Radio is your dedicated Formula 1 podcast airing on every Grand Prix week on podcast services across the internet for your amusement. If you like what you hear, follow us on Twitter @_F1 Radio to let us know what you think and to send us your F1 related questions that, if you're lucky enough, we will answer in a future episode. I'm your host, Tom Fenton, and as always, joining me today is the editor-in-chief of ReadMotorsport.com and Autosport Junior, Josh Sattil.
Yes, hello everyone, great to be on episode 3 now of F1 Radio, and of course it's a Japanese Grand Prix this weekend, so we should be back at a similar time next week as well, so you'll get back-to-back F1 Radio.
If you didn't already know, every F1 Radio episode is split into 3 juicy segments to ensure every wheel nut is tightened correctly before the episode leaves the pit box and into your various devices. Let's start off with what is and forever will be the Weekly Watch. In today's episode, we have 3 news items in the world of Formula 1. The first news item is that vacant Williams 2018 seat. Now, if you weren't aware, this is the last decent seat on the grid, and basically Williams have a few drivers who they're interested in, and specifically Kubica and Di Resta, who will be participating in a private test to battle out for that final seat. So this is, of course, if Williams decide they want to replace Massa. He might stay, who knows, but ultimately it's Kubica versus Di Resta for the prime contender to replace Massa. So Josh, what do you think about the way Williams have handled this? They seem to be very patient and, they feel like time is on their side for this drive.
Yeah, well, certainly they seem to be assessing all of their options. A little harsh on Massa, though, maybe. I mean, of course, Massa, was very kind of faithful to them. He came back after retirement to do kind of Williams a favour, of course, when Bottas had to leave to replace Rosberg. So, a bit tight, really, on Massa, and this possibly confirms that Massa might be heading out of the door. He doesn't seem 100% committed, really, to Formula 1. He's already kind of looking at other options, and, really, I think Formula E kind of excites him a little more than another year in the Williams, kind of mentoring Stroll. But of course, Massa is still a very competent driver, of course, like I said, a great mentor as well for Lance Stroll, so he's very much still an option. And then we've got Kubica and Di Resta, of course, as Tom mentioned, in this kind of weird private test scenario. It's a nice way, I think, to have, decide who takes that seat, really, and one I'd wish more teams would really do. So yeah, they're both going to roll out in apparently a 2014 Williams car, kind of similar to the one that Lance Stroll, of course, did his kind of private tests and is still doing numerous private tests in. So it'll be interesting to see, Kubica versus Di Resta. Di Resta, of course, knows the team very well. Kubica's an outsider, but of course has an illustrious F1 career before his accident. Of course, there are still a few question marks over that and his kind of fitness and kind of his consistency does seem to be one of the issues. The pace does seem to be there, though, so I think it could be a very, very close shootout. I can't really call this one. I think it's kind of impossible to say, especially with Kubica, just because we don't have really the data to determine that. I think Di Resta is a bit more of a known quantity. Williams have worked for him for quite a while now. He's been in Formula 1 before, of course, fairly recently, although not in the hybrid era. But, of course, Massa is the biggest known quantity. He's a safe option. Tom, where do you think Williams are going to go on this one?
Well, I think, like you mentioned earlier on, this is a great situation that we find ourselves in, that we're getting excited about this test. Now, I know Williams haven't, said, it's Paul Di Resta versus Kubica, but that's basically what it is. You can't tell me if Paul Di Resta doesn't perform as well against Kubica, then they're going to choose him over Kubica. It is really a 1v1. So there's going to be quite a lot of speculation and a lot of interest in this test. I think Williams, obviously they are not in a rush, and it is a bit unfair on Massa. He came out of retirement. It's not like, he retired and he really wanted another season or two. He was very adamant and happy to leave. You could tell, I don't know him personally, but from watching the coverage and hearing what he was saying, it sounded like he had put, his F1 career to bed. And obviously them scenes at Brazil last year, what a great sight that was. He was more than happy to leave. So it's a bit of a shame that he's come out and, changed his plans, and Williams aren't, giving him a favour and saying, you know what, he's a decent driver. Okay, maybe Stroll is starting to show that he's better than him now, but, Massa has got a lot of experience. He knows a lot, and it's a bit like with Schumacher, right? When he came back, there was a bit of ring rust, if you will. He wasn't the Schumacher he was before he quit or retired at Ferrari in 2006, but he still had that pedigree. He still had that amazing skill and a lot of stuff that, young drivers, it's really invaluable to have. That's why some of these drivers who are so young look so experienced. You think, wow, like Verstappen, like some of the way he carries himself, there is a bit of immaturity there, but ultimately, like, what he's learnt from his dad is priceless, and that's, one of the reasons why he's so good. But ultimately, I think, this is a decision that Williams will make. I think, obviously, Kubica, he's got the pace like we all knew. It's just whether or not he can do, a season. And how would that affect the aerodynamics of the car and the setup? I think he would have to have his own steering wheel. And obviously, Di Resta, he did do that one race in Hungary this year, but ultimately, it's really difficult to tell, how well he did there. I mean, I think in qualifying he did really good, but in the race, what do you expect? He's not going to beat Lance Stroll. It's not going to happen. So, I think whoever ends up in the seat, I like Kubica, I like Di Resta, I like Massa, so it doesn't really, matter for me. But I think we all want to see Kubica have one more shot, don't we? Let's be honest, And I don't know why they couldn't just do something, take a risk with Kubica. And maybe if, by the time they get to Europe, it's not working out. I think Kubica's the type of guy who would walk away, He would more than happily take a risk. And say if Williams came up to him and said, look, we'll give you 5 races, and as long as you prove yourself, you have the rest of the season. But I don't know if they're willing to do that. Williams usually play it more safe, but ultimately, this is going to be an interesting topic because this is the last decent seat on the grid. I'm not being funny, but Sauber, it's not a nice seat, is it? And they might sort their problems out, but this is a decent seat, So ultimately, what do the viewers think? Send us a message at _F1 Radio. Let us know who you'd like to see. Let us know who you actually think's going to be there. So, Josh, what's the second topic?
Well, this second topic, talking of kind of new or returning drivers, and this is Pierre Gasly, of course, who finally made his F1 bow this past weekend in Malaysia. It's been a long time coming, and I think it's fair to say he delivered, Tom, on his F1 debut. Before we get into this story, just your kind of quick thoughts on his debut.
I was quite surprised because you sort of got the vibe from Red Bull that they weren't really interested in him anymore. You know what I mean? They weren't really wanting to promote him. It was like, if they're happy to keep on Kvyat, then this Gasly guy, he can't be that good. But you hear a lot of good stuff about him from his previous experiences, and he hopped in the car and you're like, you know what, he did a good job. I thought in practice, I think he was pretty much there, and throughout most of the race, obviously Sainz had his issues, but I think he did good. So yeah, I approve.
Yeah, I think 15 races too late, really. He should have been in from the start of the season, in my opinion. But while he, of course, hasn't been racing in Formula 1, he's been doing Japanese Super Formula, which, of course, is their kind of Japanese Formula 1, to put it simply, really. It is a highly competitive series. It's very, very different from Formula 1 or GP2, of course, which Gasly won in 2016. A very different environment. Some drivers go there, some European drivers go there and really, really struggle because it's so, so different. There's tyres that you can really, really lean on. There's completely unfamiliar tracks, which they've probably never even heard of before. So it is a real, real challenge, but Gasly has absolutely taken to it. I mean, he had a bit of a struggle early on in the season, but now he finds himself just half a point behind the championship leader, going into the final round of the season, of course, which unfortunately clashes with the Austin Formula 1 round, of course. So Gasly, or Toro Rosso, in fact, or Red Bull, basically have a choice. Are they going to put Gasly in for that Austin F1 round in the Toro Rosso, or is he going to be able to go To the final round of Super Formula, which is actually coincidentally in Suzuka, which of course will get a bit of practice round this weekend, so could actually play perfectly. And for him to go and win that championship, because I think he's pretty much the favourite. You know, the championship leader at the moment is not having the best of times. He's not on the pace of Gasly. Gasly is a hot favourite. If he goes there, he's got a great chance of winning it. A prestigious championship. To miss one F1 race sounds like a good deal, but Gasly himself has said that he would forfeit the Super Formula title for that extra Formula 1 Grand Prix. So, Tom, what do you make of this one then? If you were in Gasly's shoes, where do you think you would be going? Missing the Japanese Super Formula, chance to win that championship, or just to completely concentrate on Formula 1 and just to grab every opportunity there?
I think it depends on what sort of negotiations and deals that he's got with Red Bull. I think if he's pretty confident that next year he's going to get a drive, then it's sort of up to him. Does he want more time in F1, or does he want to win the Super Formula? It depends how much it means to him. As we all are aware, Super Formula is not the biggest trophy in the world. It's not the one people want, but it's something else to add, and it shows that you were really good. And obviously, I think if it was me, I'd want to win that extra championship if I knew I got the drive at Toro Rosso for next season. But if I didn't have the drive next season, or if I had to fight for it, which Gasly might be having to do, then I think he'd have to take the Austin Grand Prix. I think ultimately it's really difficult. It's up to him. It's how
is it up to him though? That's the question.
That's true.
Or is it gonna be? Is it going to be Red Bull saying you're going to do this? You're going to race for F1, or you're going to go to Super Formula?
I feel like if Red Bull want him, then they'll let him do what he wants, because
that's true.
It's like, why put somebody off who you're going to potentially be putting in your primary team in a couple of years? If both Ricciardo and Verstappen leave, which is a possibility. So yeah, I think overall it's how do you rate Super Formula? How does he rate it? Does he care, or does he only care about F1? So I think ultimately he's a great driver. We've seen that. He's proven himself this weekend, and hopefully in Japan in the F1 he'll do well. And then after that, good luck to him. And as long as we can get somebody who can replace Kvyat, I'm happy, because Kvyat is, I'm sure he's a nice guy, but he's dead weight. He's never gonna win anything.
Talking of that, Tom, if I can just kind of segue slightly. Of course, there's 2 Toro Rosso seats next year up for grabs. Sainz is gone. We know he won't be there. Gasly, I think, pretty much nailed on for one of those seats. This is kind of confirmation of what we all thought about him. He's very good. Hopefully Toro Rosso think the same. So he'll be in one of the seats. But then there's that second seat, and of course you mentioned Danny Fiat. Other Red Bull juniors, there's no one eligible pretty much. There is no one even close to Formula 1, right? So, Red Bull, Toro Rosso, should make a power play for a certain other young driver on the grid, a certain other young driver who's out of favour, a certain German by the name of Pascal Wehrlein. Pascal Wehrlein to Toro Rosso.
I'd like to see
take
that.
him off Mercedes' hands, who haven't been able to give him the seat he wanted. He can't get in at Williams because of the age rule, so Red Bull can nick him and prove to Mercedes what a great driver he is. I mean, what better satisfaction than beating someone with their own driver?
That would be cool. I mean, I think honestly, if anybody's going to replace Kvyat, it's going to be a Honda driver, because I think that's sort of the deal that would have happened. But yeah, I know in an ideal world, I don't like the way Pascal Wehrlein carries himself, but that doesn't mean he's not a good driver. And he's got time to mature, right? He's not the oldest guy on the grid by any stretch of the imagination. So once he starts to learn the ways to behave, and I'm not saying he's got a big problem, but I think there's a reason why Force India, picked Ocon over him, and I think it's all down to attitude. So if he can, take a step back, and hopefully, when he's been in Sauber, he's realised, okay, I need to, be a bit more sensible as well. Because he's clearly got the pace. It's obvious that. I mean, it's difficult. Ericsson isn't exactly the best person to test yourself against, right? But Ericsson can sometimes do quite well, and Wehrlein really has, in my opinion, shown that he's way better. And obviously, last season he did very well, so it'd be awesome to see that. But do you really see a Mercedes driver going to a Red Bull car? It's just that's the problem.
I think it's unlikely. In an ideal world, if I was in charge of Toro Rosso, I'd be going for it. I mean, the way Wehrlein scored those points on 2 occasions this year, in Spain and in Baku, just kind of nicking those points, I thought was so impressive. I think that's what drivers like Ericsson are kind of missing, that final bit really, and that's what Wehrlein's got. So, hopefully he'll be on the F1 grid next year, although, of course, at the moment it's unlikely. But I think we should move on to news item 3, Tom, which
Yes.
you're about to tell us all about.
Yes, the last news item, which is quite really, it's just a statement. It's not really any news as such, but this is all about Valtteri Bottas. Now, he's been having a bit of a bad time recently, Josh. Let's not deny it. Let's not pretend like, now that he's signed the contract, he can chill out a bit. Obviously, I think, he's signed the contract and it was sort of part of the deal that he has to give up this year's championship, for himself anyway. He has to support Hamilton, but let's not deny it. He's had quite a few poor performances recently. I'm not just saying poor, abysmal. Like, obviously, at Malaysia, what was he, like a second every lap off?
40 seconds he finished behind.
It's like, how in the same car? That's embarrassing. I think what this does highlight is just how well Rosberg, how good he was as a driver. Obviously there were times when Hamilton was untouchable, but Rosberg was never that far behind. It was usually a couple of tenths either way. So Bottas, maybe he's relaxed a bit more because he's got another year, but come on, Josh. I'd imagine you have more stats about exactly how bad he is. I mean, I can't remember. When did this start?
For me, and not many people agree, but I think it was Hungary in the race, because he qualified well, but that was the race where Vettel had his issue, and obviously he was kind of holding up Raikkonen and Hamilton, and Bottas couldn't really keep pace with a wounded Ferrari. So I felt like that was the start of the problem. So maybe that was kind of playing in his mind. Obviously, Hamilton then gave him the podium back. And then, for some reason, just over the over the summer break, and obviously that contract extension, he wasn't great in Spa at all, really. He came home second in Monza, but was nowhere in the wet in qualifying, and really had kind of second by default, and then was third in Singapore, and then, of course, fifth in Malaysia. So the results themselves aren't really that bad, but we know from watching the races, of course, and the lap times, that it really hasn't been great. Take Singapore, for example, right? He was passed by Jolyon Palmer on the restart, for the safety car.
I remember that.
He really can't drive in the wet anyway, at the moment anyway. I mean, he's shown decently in the wet before, but really he just hasn't had the same confidence as Hamilton in really any conditions since the summer break. What he was doing in the first half of the year was fantastic. That was a real kind of good performance, a real great way to kind of announce himself on a big stage, really. He took 2 wins. He was right close to Hamilton. He was giving Hamilton a bit of a headache. He was a fairly serious championship contender as well. He was picking up points when Hamilton was having poor weekends, but now he can get nowhere near him, and I don't think he's actually beaten him in a qualifying or race session since, apart from, of course, that orchestrated swap in Hungary. So Bottas with a lot to do. Most difficult time in his career by his own admission.
And with that slightly awkward silence, it's time for Racing Report.
Today's Racing Report is, of course, focusing on the 2017 Malaysian Grand Prix. Max Verstappen taking his second career win. Quite the shock, really, coming, of course, from third on the grid, or what was pretty much second on the grid. Hamilton, of course, was second, Ricciardo third, Sebastian Vettel, of course, after that dramatic Q1 failure, which, of course, saw him start at the back of the grid, was fourth. His Ferrari teammate, Kimi Raikkonen, didn't even start the race. A disastrous weekend, really, for Ferrari in terms of reliability. Good damage limitation, though, from Vettel to get up to fourth, although, of course, he could have possibly got third, but then, of course, had to back off because of various engine issues. Bottas a distant fifth, of course, which kind of already alluded to. Perez sixth, Van Dorn seventh, Stroll eighth, Massa ninth, and Esteban Ocon was in 10th. In terms of the championship after this race, then, of course, Hamilton now has a 34-point lead over Sebastian Vettel, and in the constructors, Mercedes are inching closer and closer to wrapping up this constructors championship fairly early. A real big advantage Mercedes have in the championship at the moment, but the advantage in the race and over the weekend really wasn't there, Tom. Mercedes not really on top of this, and facing a big pressure from Red Bull this weekend, and a real surprise performance and surprise win for Max Verstappen, but a commanding 12 seconds. I'm pretty sure, Tom, you didn't see this coming, because I certainly didn't.
No, not at all. I thought, as we've all been saying, it's who's going to be fastest, Ferrari or Mercedes, and that's what we've been saying all year. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, Red Bull, come along and, okay, maybe they weren't the fastest car, but they were way faster than, like, they had Mercedes covered. Like, there's no question about it that, yes, okay, maybe if, in case you didn't know, there was a situation with Hamilton's engine where basically what Mercedes do is they use so much power at the beginning of the race that it sometimes takes them a few laps to get back onto a level where they're distributing the power more equally. So down the straights, Hamilton wasn't going as fast as usual, and that's how Verstappen got ahead of him. But in an era where apparently it's so difficult to follow another car, I mean, the Red Bull was like literally like sewn onto the back of the Mercedes. That's just like the only way I could describe it, because I was watching it and I was like, there's no way that Verstappen's going to lose this. Like, how can Hamilton keep him behind? I don't care if they've got an engine advantage. So ultimately, yeah, Verstappen, what a great drive. I think the first win of his career back in Spain last year wasn't really that dominant. I think, if Kimi Räikkönen maybe was in his prime, it would have been a different result. But this one, he was in control. It looked like nobody could touch him. And I think he was even clear of Ricciardo, even if Ricciardo would have got past Bottas much earlier. But ultimately, yeah, Mercedes have got problems. They've got serious things to think about. I mean, is it a blip? Singapore, they knew they probably weren't going to be fast. But Malaysia, you thought more likely they're gonna do something, and they didn't. They were probably the third fastest car. I mean, we all are assuming that Ferrari was faster than Red Bull, so that would have made them fastest, then Red Bull, then Mercedes. So ultimately, they were lucky to get away with the podium. Obviously, Ferrari, another weekend where they've absolutely messed everything up. And as we were talking about this before we actually aired the show, is this going to cost them? Obviously, Singapore, there was a loss of 43 points, and I'm not really bothered about the constructors because I think we're both in agreement. I think everybody's in agreement that they're not going to win the constructors Ferrari. It's not going to happen. But in the drivers, obviously Sebastian's got a great chance, and he still has got a good chance. Bearing him, or if obviously Hamilton does have an issue, then he's got a great chance. But ultimately, he's still in it. But there's basically 50 points that he should have picked up, and what has he walked away with? 12, right? Obviously, Singapore, he didn't score, and he finished fourth in Malaysia. So, he's basically on a huge deficit, and if he would have scored the 50 points, he would have been ahead of Hamilton right now. So, I don't know, Josh, what do you make of the whole situation? We remember in Singapore, like we talked about last episode, is this a championship defining moment? But it's like the effects of Singapore were knocked on to Malaysia. And, that issue where he couldn't get out in Q1, starting at the back of the grid, he did a great drive, there's no question about it. But it's damage limitation, but again, it's a race where they should have won.
Yeah, for sure. Singapore for sure should have been an easy win. They should have gained massive points on Mercedes and Hamilton. And Malaysia, they should have at least been fighting for the win. Should have been at least on that podium. And it wasn't to be for Vettel, and they did seem pretty rattled this weekend. But at the same time, I saw loads of articles about, Vettel and his kind of attitude problem and his way of approaching championships. But at the same time, when he had that failure on Saturday, he was shaking the hands of all his mechanics, he was smiling, or, smiling as much as he can in that situation. He was keeping up a beat, and he came back the next day and produced a real kind of cool drive. And was kind of no tantrums or anything like that. A small one at Alonso, and even when he had that collision with Stroll after the race, he wasn't really too angry about that. So, and of course, escaping a gearbox penalty as well, which was I think a crucial thing for Japan.
Breaking news, everybody! Breaking news.
Yeah, which is really, really good news for everybody, I think. Even Hamilton fans, because I think, they're going to want Hamilton to win this championship on merit, in a straight fight, in a proper fight, without reliability issues. So that'll be really nice to see in Suzuka. We could have a proper three-way fight, I think. And what I was saying off air as well was that, we've got 5 races left, and we might not have the championship fight that we really want as neutrals, but we might have 5 really, really good individual races between 3 teams that all seem pretty even on pace, all kind of yo-yoing from race to race. I think, for me, just going back slightly to Mercedes issues, it seems like Red Bull have taken a step forward more than anything else, really. They seem to be right up there with Ferrari and Mercedes. Mercedes will not be like this every weekend, I'm sure. They'll probably be right back on in Suzuka, but I think Red Bull are now close enough where they can, I think sneak in and win. If a driver like Verstappen's having a really, really good weekend, like I think he did in Malaysia, then I think he's going to be picking up possibly even another victory before the season's out. It's not out the realms of possibility, because Hamilton and Vettel are focusing on the championship. Ricciardo and Verstappen can just really throw everything at it and could pick up another surprise win. Although Vettel, of course, I think just has to go all in now. I think, Tom, he can't play championship, but is Hamilton playing championship? That is the question. Was that move, did he not kind of defend as much as he could have done against Verstappen? Was that letting him go, possibly?
I mean, I think at a certain stage you've got to, realise that they're now very close to the end of the championship. So I know, it's 1/20 rounds. So what you do in Australia, the first round of the season is just as important as what you do in the last. It doesn't make no difference. You don't get any more points for the last one, apart from obviously in 2014 where they decided to do that, which, was a bad decision. But
Vettel
anyway,
would need that now, wouldn't he? That would be perfect for Vettel.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. I mean, I think obviously we all are aware that if things go as they have gone throughout the whole season, then Vettel will not win the championship. We need basically Mercedes to have an issue, and I'm not talking about Singapore or Malaysia. I'm talking about retirement. They don't score points, specifically obviously Hamilton. That's the only way that Vettel really gets back in the championship, unless he's going to win all the last races. If he can guarantee he's going to do that, then he will win the championship, but it's not going to happen. And you made a great point about Red Bull. They have made a step forward. There's no question about it. I mean, who would have said, even coming out of maybe even something like Spa, who would have said that they would be winning in Malaysia? Like, I would have said, what are you talking about? What's wrong with you? There's no way that car's going to win. And Malaysia isn't the most power-hungry circuit, but it's not really a Red Bull track, in my opinion. Their track suit, it's a bit like McLaren, right? They like the slow speed, lots of corners, Singapore, basically street circuits. So if they can win in Malaysia, they've got a great chance in Singapore. It's not Singapore, Suzuka. So if Mercedes are having a bad day, or even if they're not, Red Bull are going to be right there, and that just adds that element of risk. Obviously, Verstappen is somebody, and even Ricciardo, they're very much, they aren't in a championship battle. So what if they, lose the race or get retired? It's just move on to the next one. They haven't got to worry about the championship. So, you could have a situation where obviously the Red Bulls will start playing the championship up in either way, who knows. So it's interesting from that point of view. I just hope, like you said, that we now are going to have at least 5 races where we've got 3 teams who are capable of winning it, because it does look like Red Bull have made a huge step forward. So I think it's great for Verstappen to finally have a race that he deserved to win. I'm not saying he didn't deserve Spain last time out, because it's very, really difficult to hop in a new car and win, but this one, he dominated. And
a sign of things to come, right?
Yeah, I think we all know that given the right equipment, he and Ricciardo have a great chance of winning the championship, and it could be a new rivalry that we've always wanted. Obviously, Hamilton, Rosberg didn't really, it wasn't really that good. They weren't really that aggressive, I guess. But obviously, Verstappen and Ricciardo look like they really would, get into each other and turn it into a bit of a brawl, whatever. Which is, I'm not saying that that's what we need, but people like a bit of that. So I'm not going to pretend like that's not what it is. But yeah, so obviously Hamilton, he maybe is starting to play that game of let's just do what needs to be done. Let's not take any risks. I think he could have defended a lot heavier against Verstappen down into turn 1. There's no question about it. But why take that risk? Maybe it is going to come back and, really ruin his championship. Like in Hungary, where he gave, obviously, the podium back to Bottas. But, 34 points ahead, 5 races to go, that's some good stats. I'm not going to pretend like, I want them to be equal going into the last race. That's what I want. And then whoever wins the race is the champion. That would be awesome. But the stats don't say that that's going to happen now. So I think Hamilton knows he's in a great position. Assuming the car doesn't break down, that's fine. But obviously if it does break down, then he's going to be regretting not trying to fight Verstappen harder. So it sort of swings and roundabouts, I guess. But ultimately, we could discuss Ferrari, Mercedes, Sebastian Vettel, Hamilton all day long, Josh, couldn't we? There's no question about it. We're going to have to just see what happens. But I think we should move the conversation on towards the other teams, and specifically, let's talk about McLaren, Josh. And specifically Van Dorn. Now, I'm not going to lie. As soon as he joined F1 and, them first few races, I was like, this kid isn't ready. Obviously he had such a big hype about him, and you yourself were very positive about him, and I was very positive as well. But as soon as you saw his performances the first few races of the season, you were like, I have a lot of question marks about whether this guy should be in F1 next year. But he proved himself in Malaysia, 7th place, rightfully earned. And I think the most important point is that he absolutely annihilated Alonso. And this is something that you don't see. Like Button, sometimes he was faster, and sometimes Alonso was faster, but you never saw Button annihilate Alonso. It looked like Alonso was wearing the wrong crash helmet. Am I wrong, Josh?
No, you definitely aren't. Of course, 7th place for Van Dorn, second weekend in a row. He was very impressive in the wet in Singapore, and equally impressive, I think, actually probably even more impressive, like you said, probably the best drive of his short F1 career so far. Just a complete contrast to his early season form. He's really come on a very, very long way, pretty much since his kind of contract extension. He's just been going from strength to strength, getting closer and closer to Alonso, and now he's been rewarded with a big couple of results ahead of Alonso as well in the championship now. Alonso hasn't scored since Baku, of course, which is a lot more down to reliability than Alonso himself. But Van Dorn has scored 3 times since Baku, so really it's kind of been swinging much, much more towards Van Dorn, both reliability and kind of the pace as well. Alonso's now got a fight on his hands, really, I think, for the rest of this year and next year, and it's what McLaren really do want, and what we want, I think, as fans as well, to really see 2 drivers really pushing each other. You've got such a kind of juxtaposition between the 2 of them. Alonso coming to the end of his career, we're looking for that kind of last title, and Van Dorn very much the future face of McLaren, or at least they hope he will be. So we've got this really nice kind of mix there, and I think it should be very exciting next year, especially if they could be challenging for podiums, we hope, along with Renault as well.
I mean, I must admit, as a McLaren fan myself, that one performance of Van Dorn's in Malaysia was enough to just confirm to me that the future is safe at McLaren in terms of drivers at the very least. I was worrying, even since he renewed the contract, and we were saying this before, how in Bottas's case, he has got worse since the contract has been renewed. But in Van Dorn's case, it's really, he's taken a new leaf. He's found a new spring in his step, and he's really performed. But now it's like that Malaysia, sometimes just one performance can just change your opinion on somebody. And that is exactly what happened for me on Van Dorn. And I know, 7th place, but 7th place in a McLaren Honda at Malaysia is, I wasn't even thinking we'd be getting points. I'm not going to lie. So, yeah, that's a great performance. There's no question about it. And, does Alonso want to hang around, for too long? He's going to have to start performing, hopefully this is a blip for Alonso, right? One bad race, maybe Van Dorn was really good.
Of course, yeah. He'll be right back in it, yeah.
But we don't want to see this, because obviously Alonso is getting older. People can pretend like he's still going to be capable of winning championships, but he won't be capable of winning championships forever. So if it gets to a situation whereby maybe Van Dorn is constantly an annoyance to him, he won't want to stay at McLaren regardless if they can give him a car to win. As we know, what happened with him and Hamilton in 2007. McLaren had the car to win, and maybe there was more to it, but Hamilton was probably too close for comfort for Alonso, and that's probably why he caused a lot of controversy. But either way, I think another team to talk about, and specifically driver, is Force India, and that being Perez. Now, Josh, I think you have a little bit more information about this, but the main point is that he was a bit ill. Is that not correct?
Yes, very ill apparently, in terms of, really bad virus. IV kind of drip before the race.
Wow.
So it did sound pretty bad really for Perez, but kind of soldiered on and came home sick. Probably one of the best drives of his season really, which is definitely saying something. Malaysia, of course, one of the toughest races of the year. This is coming off the back of a 5th in Singapore, so it's really kind of bolstered his championship. Well back on track now after those kind of silly incidents with Ocon, and this is definitely what we want to see from Perez. A little late in terms of silly season, but still ending the season, I think, very, very strongly. And it's good for Force India to kind of have these troubles behind them. Ocon not quite having a good race, a couple of spins, bits of contact on the opening lap, and then that kind of spin later on in the race, contact with the signs. So not an ideal race for Ocon, still got a point, but a very good race for Perez considering the circumstances.
And I think the final team we should make a mention to is Williams. Now, I'm not picking them up for any particular reason apart from the fact that they've actually had a good race. You know, there's a lot of issues around, obviously, their 2018 seat, as we've literally just spoke about, but what a good drive from both of them, both to get in the points as far as I'm aware. And obviously there was the little issue between Stroll and Vettel after the race, but I think they showed a really good performance throughout the weekend. I don't think they performed poorly in qualifying, or am I imagining this wrong? I think overall they just had a good weekend finally for once, which is really good to see for a team like Williams.
Yeah, that's true. It was a decent performance from them, kind of tripping over themselves a little bit in terms of their kind of swapping positions. They could have probably beat Van Dorn, but, Stroll has come along a long way. He's only a point behind Massa in the championship now, so those two, a bit like Alonso and Van Dorn, very, very close.
So, Josh, we're almost at the checkered flag of this episode, but before we cross the line, what is it time for?
Well, it's time for the final segment of the show where we answer a question submitted by you, the listeners, the F1 radio community. It's time for the questionable queries.
What the hell is happening in the exit on 12? I have no power if I don't push the K1. Do we really think that the tires will last in the end of the race? Because it doesn't feel like it. Do you really want that I keep going? Because it's just absolute.
So, Josh, what's today's topic of conversation, and who asks?
We actually got quite a few questions, so we will be saving some of them for the next week's podcast, which of course should be on after Suzuka, but we picked two that came in first, just to be fair. This first one's from EVR Matt212, and he says, thoughts on Jolyon Palmer as a future world champion. Also, if you're owning an F1 team and you couldn't pick any current or past F1 drivers, who would you pick? So he's basically saying, obviously, about Palmer being a future world champion. Obviously, it means in lawnmower racing or something, rather than F1. And then, obviously, about the kind of two non-F1 drivers. I'm just going to jump straight in and say Valentino Rossi. Prime Valentino Rossi, probably not the one now. Maybe kind of 10 years ago, when he was very, very close to getting into F1. That'd have been pretty cool to see, I think, and a very, very unique possibility. Probably not seen since, of course, Surtees 1 on 2 and 4 wheels. And then Felix Rosenqvist, who I think is definitely one of the biggest drivers, really, not to kind of miss out on an F1 seat in recent times. They're big, big talent, but unfortunately couldn't quite get the funding or the opportunity, but is now having a really, really good career in the Formula E. So yeah, Rossi and Rosenqvist for me. I think Tom, his expertise lay in Formula 1 mainly, so...
Yeah, let's just say I'm not exactly well-knowledged around all motorsports that exist in the world. Obviously, I think Rossi, he's a guy who's been on a motorbike or something. He's pretty good at that, I think. He's won some championships or whatever, so... Nah, I'm messing. Yeah, obviously he had that test with Ferrari in around 2006, and I think you alluded to it before, that he was pretty close to Schumacher's pace, so... Maybe that would be interesting, but I just think, he's a motorcyclist. He's not a car driver, whatever that equivalent is. Is it just car driver, or is there a specific word that I'm looking for?
No, I think that's better. On four
car
wheels.
Driver.
But, he's had, like I said, he's had loads of success on 2 wheels, so I don't think he's actually, he's not
He's had his time.
It.
He doesn't need to come across and, show off. Yeah, just stay
it
on
would
your
be
bike.
nice. A bit of crossover, a one-off event, maybe, where everyone swaps. Everyone swaps around, IndyCar, NASCAR.
Be interesting, some sort of like circus.
It would be. I mean, it's called the Race of Champions, isn't it? Where everyone gets together. But maybe they should invite some MotoGP riders next time. That'd be pretty cool. That's an idea anyway for anyone listening. Anyway, we'll move on to a question that you should be able to answer. This one's from @I_am_infi, and he says, will teams like Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull, who have spent more time developing this year's car, be behind for next season? So have Mercedes and Ferrari, I think in particular, put a bit too much into this year's car, which might compromise them for next season, Tom?
So we were talking about this offline, and we thought that because the regulations are frozen between now and next year, obviously apart from the halo being added, that effectively what you develop for this year's car is going to have some relevance to next year's car, unless of course you change your philosophy, right? So we're assuming that Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull, etc., and probably most of the teams, apart from the likes of McLaren or Toro Rosso, who've got to design it around a new engine, their cars are going to be very similar to this year. So the extra dynamics, or should I say the extra parts that are trying to increase the aerodynamics of the car and downforce, etc., that they put on now is not really wasted. It can definitely be used, and in the worst case scenario, it can be modified a little bit to suit next year's car. So that's my take on it. Josh, where do you stand?
Yeah, very, very similar. Christian Horner said in an interview a couple of months ago now, anything they kind of develop onto the car for this year, like you pretty much said, it can be used in next year's car. So it's going to be more of an evolution than a revolution next year. So really, no, it's not going to compromise them. Might compromise Ferrari and Mercedes a little bit more than Red Bull, though. So, possibly would give Red Bull a bit of an advantage, we'd hope anyway. Because it'd be really, really cool to see a three-way fight between those three, and a real kind of, whether they're pretty much intertwined, and having a kind of four-way fight for the championship and the drivers. I include everyone apart from possibly Bottas and Raikkonen. Can't quite see them challenging for the championship, but if the car's there for Hamilton, Vettel, Ricciardo, and Verstappen, they will all be up there. And then hopefully, we'll get a few of the other teams taking advantage. I don't know really where people are at with the development, who kind of ended early or whatever, but I don't think it really matters too much because. I think Force India were kind of late pretty much every year, and they seem to get it together. So, yeah, I think basically our answer is no to that question. They will not be that far behind for next season, and they will easily bring it back up because, of course, those three teams have way more money than anyone else. So they're going to bring it back, is the concluding point, I think, from our question. But yeah, thank you to both of you two for sending in questions. I think we've got about 3 other questions as well, so we'll definitely save them up for next week after Japan. And of course, if you guys do have a question, then please leave it in the comment section below if you're watching on YouTube, or tweet us, of course, as Tom mentioned, at _F1 Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and petrol heads all around the world, we've reached the end of this race. I thank Josh for co-hosting the show with me today, and I also thank you guys, the listeners. It's people like you and I that keep the racing spirit alive in this crazy world of Formula 1, so we cannot thank you enough for supporting the show. Please like, subscribe, rate, review, and share this episode across the various platforms that host F1 Radio, including iTunes, YouTube, and Tuning, if you like what you've heard. Until next time, it's been a pleasure to serve.